Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. As always, we begin by reminding you that we here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church believe that Jesus is the Christ, that he's the Son of the living God who lived a perfect life and died a sacrificial death for your sins and for mine, and that if you will place your hope and trust in Jesus Christ as both Lord and Savior, that you will be saved. If you'd like more information about what it means to make Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, we would invite you to follow the link in our description. This will take you to a full gospel presentation. It'll also show you how to respond to the gospel and how to connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we would love for you to join us for worship right here on Sunday mornings at 11 o'clock. We are both in person and online through Facebook Live. If you do not live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we still want to connect with you because we want to help you find a Bible-believing church where you do live. As we continue on in our study of the Gospel of Matthew, we are now in session 8, which is titled Mercy Extended. And we're going to be looking at the 9th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, specifically verses 10 through 19, and then verses 23 through 26. So again, this is session 8, titled Mercy Extended, looking at Matthew chapter 9, verses 10 through 19, and then 23 through 26. As we get started in our study today, I want to begin by reading you the opening paragraph to our personal study guide. And it says this, it says, suffering is everywhere. Hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, and wildfires are in the news frequently. All to that cancer, heart disease, dementia, and broken relationships. Overlooking the suffering of others is easy to do when each of us is facing our own form of suffering. We often neglect to extend compassion to others when we ourselves need compassion. Thankfully, Jesus never overlooks the suffering that we face. He shows compassion and mercy to all who come to him. When we think about this word mercy, we often, might think about, well, what does that word mean? And you may even take some time, this morning, and I really want and ponder that. What is mercy? What does it mean to have mercy? And, we have the working definition that we often hear in churches today, and mercy is not getting what we do deserve. And a lot of times when we are shown mercy, it's because we are deserving of some sort of judgment or something unpleasant, but because of God is merciful, he doesn't give it to us. And a lot of times mercy really involves just the idea of us going through different things, or us, maybe even reaping the consequences of something that we are the direct result of, and yet there's some sort of alleviation to that, some sort of help. The book actually pulls this definition from the Bible dictionary, and it says this: one's consideration of the condition and needs of his fellow man. And so there's this idea that when we are showing mercy, when we are being merciful, we are taking into consideration, we are thinking about the condition and the suffering and the needs of someone else. Our mercy towards others is always rooted in God's mercy towards us. And then the book asks this question. It says, in what ways can we show mercy to in our everyday encounters? And we're going to ask questions like this throughout our study, and we want to give you an opportunity to interact with those questions. And so throughout the study, when I ask a question, we're going to encourage you to pause the video. And when you pause the video, if you're by yourself, take some time to maybe write down some responses, take notes as you go, to get a pen, paper, write down your responses just to give you an opportunity to interact with the questions and the things we're saying. And if you're watching this with your spouse or your whole family, we would encourage you, actually have those discussions. Talk about the questions that we ask. And in both cases, when you're done writing or you're done discussing it, just hit play again and we'll keep going in our study. So our first question is this, is in what ways can we show mercy in our everyday encounters? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, answer that question, either write something down or have that discussion. And whenever you're ready, just hit play again and we'll keep going in our study. All right. Hopefully you've had a couple minutes to discuss that, and I'm sure you've come up with some great ways to do that. And I always just try to, just something I really try to do on the regular is be kind of mindful with people that are working. So if I'm patroning a restaurant or some sort of store, I always try to be very gracious and very, very kind when I'm encountering people as they work, because I have no idea what kind of day they're having. And a lot of times, if I'm having an issue or I need assistance, I'm probably one of many people on top of their just normal workload that has been coming to them needing help. And so I just always try to be as graceful and as kind and as appreciative and thankful as I can possibly be. And that's just one of those little ways that I can kind of have a merciful encounter as I go about my day. Now, as we get into our study today, we're going to actually be getting into a neat place, which is after Matthew has kind of introduced himself. And so this is obviously the Gospel of Matthew. And yet Matthew, chapter 9 begins with the calling of this gentleman named Levi, which the other Gospels call Matthew. And it's not uncommon for someone in Jesus' day to have more than one name. They might have a Greek name, and then as well as a Hebrew name, and maybe even a nickname or anything like that on top of that. And so our passage begins with Matthew kind of really giving his firsthand account, and this is kind of how things start for him. And the book says this about it. It says, the writer of our gospel gives a personal glimpse into his own calling to be a disciple. While Mark and Luke also record the calling of Matthew, in those two gospels he is called Levi, which was his Hebrew name. Matthew was his Greek name. He was a tax collector for the Roman government. No doubt Matthew included the story of his calling to point to the fact that Jesus extended grace even to those considered to be an outcast. After calling Matthew, Jesus also attended a banquet with sinners. And as we study today's verses, focus on how Jesus showed mercy and how he wants us to follow that example. So we're going to dive into our passage this morning, and we're going to start off with verses 10 through 13. And I want you to, as we look at this, I want you to just think about what's being said here. Look at kind of the direct quotes that are happening here to get an idea of really what's happening in our passage. So picking up in verse 10 and reading through verse 13, we read these words. It says, while he, now that's Jesus, was reclining at the table at the house, many tax collectors and sinners came to eat with Jesus and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Now, when he heard this, he said, it is not those who are well who need a doctor, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners. So if we look at our passage, we see a couple of kind of direct quotes here. We have first off the Pharisees, and they're the ones who ask, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Why does he eat with these people? And Jesus responds back to this. One of the things the book points out that I thought was interesting is it points out that we don't know if he literally answered the Pharisees directly. Did he take a break from the party to address their concerns? Or did this get brought up to him later? Did they go to, because he noticed the Pharisees go to his people. They asked his disciples this question, and maybe the disciples eventually relayed that to him, and then he used it as a teaching moment. But either way, we see him answer the question, and he gives this story of a doctor and going to the sick and not the healthy. The book says this. It says, this was the hometown. They're back in Capernaum. This is the hometown of Peter and Andrew and James and John. And Matthew also worked there as a tax collector. After he has accepted Jesus' call to discipleship, Matthew immediately reached out to his friends. Despite the social stigma attached to tax collectors and sinners, Jesus attended a banquet at Matthew's house. This drew the attention and the contempt of the religious elite. That leads the book to ask this question, which is, what does it mean for Jesus to be a friend of sinners? Why don't you take a couple minutes, answer that question, and then whenever you're ready, let's hit play again and we'll keep going in our study. So, what does it mean for Jesus to be a friend of sinners? And we want to be careful because in our culture today, a lot of times we associate this idea with Jesus being a friend to sinners, meaning that Jesus was okay with sin, that Jesus never judged people, and that Jesus, never looked at anybody doing anything wrong. And that's not actually the case. In fact, he was very direct and harsh towards the religious elite. He still called people out for their sin and for their disbelief. And in a lot of ways, he did condemn the things that were wrong, but he was a friend of sinners in the sense that the book kind of talked about in this idea of like a social stigma, that these were people who had done something wrong, had obviously made mistakes, who had sinned. And because of that, they were put into this category of sinners where it felt like they had nowhere to go. There was no room for redemption. There was no room for forgiveness. There was no room for confession and repentance. That all of those things were past them, and they just had to live in their sin. And Jesus didn't do that. The Bible doesn't do that. Jesus didn't do that. And so even those who had made mistakes, even those that might have been in this category, of this class that the Jews called sinners, he would go to them because he wanted to teach them and preach to them repentance and the forgiveness of sins. The Pharisees had a very negative response to Jesus' willingness to be associated with these sinners. And because of that, they approached his disciples. Notice they approached his disciples and not Jesus directly. I don't know if this is cowardice. I don't know if this is a desire to lessen his influence on those people, but we see that he was not going, that the Pharisees were not going to address Jesus directly, and yet Jesus did still have a response to them. The book says it this way. It says Jesus was aware of the intent of the Pharisees, but refused to take the bait. Instead, he answered the question directly by quoting a well-known proverb of the day. The proverb stated that it is a sick people who need a doctor. Jesus, however, shifted the meaning of the proverb away from physical healing, and he had already demonstrated his power and his willingness to heal physical maladies. Spiritual healing was Jesus' focus, and he addressed it to the Pharisees. Jesus' quote in here that we read about earlier, that I desire mercy and not sacrifice, is actually a quote of Hosea 6:6. And his desire, and we think about this and the intention here, we realize that it's talking about wanting more than just the religiousness that came with it, but really the heart and the attitude that came with submission to God. This leads the book to ask this question, which is, how would you summarize what Jesus came to do? Looking at this passage, looking at what Jesus is saying, how would you, maybe to someone who said, well, why did Jesus come? If he didn't just come to show us a new way, if he didn't just come to start a new religion, why did Jesus come? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, answer that question, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so hopefully you've had a chance to answer that. And I want to encourage you that Jesus came to pay the price for sin. Jesus came to restore our relationship. Paul refers to it as the ministry of reconciliation. I love how the book says it. It says Jesus came to show mercy and lead people into a relationship with him by grace through faith, and that he wanted people to place their hope and trust in him and therefore be saved of their sins. And to be quite honest, that's what God has called us to do as well. He has called us to go and to make disciples of all nations and to call people into a loving relationship with the Father. Let's keep going, though. Let's look at verses 14 through 17, and we're going to see another group enter the picture who are kind of complaining the same way, but they're very different than the first group. So if you remember, the first group we met was the Pharisees. Why do you eat with sinners and tax collectors? Why do you do this? Now look at what we see here. It says, then John's disciples came to them, saying, why do you and the Pharisees, or excuse me, why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast? Jesus said to them, can the wedding guests be sad while the groom is with them? The time will come when the groom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one patches an old garment on unshrunk cloth, because the patch pulls away from the garment and makes the tear worse. And no one puts a new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the skin will burst and the wine spills out, and the skins are ruined. No, they put new wine into fresh wineskins, and both are preserved. And so we have this really interesting thing here. So we have a different group showing up. As the first one, it was the Pharisees, and they didn't really talk with Jesus. They talked with the disciples. And in the midst of all that, they were complaining about who he was associating with. John's disciples, and this is John, the disciples, those that had followed John the Baptist, they come, but they speak to Jesus directly. And quite frankly, they say, why are you different? Why is it that who we follow, who a lot of people would put John and Jesus into the same camp, that they are kind of co-ministers, if you will, even because they don't quite get what Jesus is and his relationship to John. But our people, we fast. We follow all these we fast on certain days, we fast at certain times. We're doing all of these things to do everything we can to be in a right relationship with God. But then we see your people and your disciples, and they're not fasting at all. And why is that? I don't understand that. And to answer that question, Jesus points to he makes three analogies. He talks about the groom, he talks about the cloth or the patch, and he talks about the wineskin. And all of those kind of put to the idea that, hey, he's different. This is not the same thing. And so he talks about the groom, and with the groom, he says that you don't mourn and you don't fast and you don't do these things when the groom is with you. It would not be appropriate. It would not be the right time for that. That there is a right time for that, and that the right time is coming, but now is not the right time for it. It's very important to note that Jesus isn't condemning fasting. He's not saying you shouldn't fast anymore, that fasting is a thing of the past, but he's rather saying it's not the right time for fasting. They are serving a different purpose. They are doing something different. We are doing something different now. Now the time for fasting will come. And with that, he talks about both the patch that is going to potentially shrink and tear the garment, as well as the wineskins that will not expand with the fermenting wine, and in both cases that will do damage. And he's talking this idea that Jesus is coming to do something new. And because he is coming to do something new, because this is a new work, it's not going to just fit neatly into the old traditions and the old ways of doing things. Again, he's not writing off the Old Testament. He's not writing off the synagogues or anything like that. But he is saying that, hey, you've created traditions and you've created routines and you've created things to help you walk with the Lord. But what we are doing is something new. We are entering into, Jesus is kind of alluding here to the new covenant. And the new covenant is going to look different than the old covenant, even if it's not doing away with it, it's not tossing it aside, but it is going to look different. And if you take your old traditions and try to force them into what I am doing and the message that I'm bringing, they're just not going to work, and it's actually going to do damage. The book says it this way. It says Jesus never rejected fasting as a spiritual discipline, but he did emphasize a new approach to living in relationship with God. And this new approach stood in stark contrast to both the legalism of the Pharisees and the austerity of John's followers. That leads the book to ask this question, which was, what does Jesus offer that religion does not? Now, I'm not a huge fan of this question because I don't like that old statement that Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. I understand the sentiment. I'm not a huge fan of the statement, but let's carefully consider this question a little bit. What does Jesus offer that religion, and especially, we can look at either the Old Testament idea or just religion in our culture in general, does not offer? Take a couple minutes, answer that question, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right. So what does Jesus offer that religion does not? And we might look at that idea of, like, Jesus is not calling us just to another set of rules, or he's not calling us to try to put burdens and put things on us to try to meet God or to get where God is. We can certainly talk about that, but I want to say, more than anything, when we are trusting in our works, when we're trusting in our obedience to a set of rules, which is often the case of religion, our best that we could ever hope for is I hope I was good enough. I hope I did a good enough job. I hope I followed well enough. I hope I did more good than bad. And we always just hope for the best, but we don't really know whether we have pleased God or not. When we turn to Jesus and when we place our hope and trust in Jesus, we're not hoping in our works. We're hoping in the completed work of Christ in the death and resurrection. And so when we place our faith into Jesus, we no longer have to say, I hope I was good enough, but we can say, I have placed my trust in the completed work of Christ. And because of who he is and because of the resurrection, I know I'm in a right relationship with God. I know that my sins have been paid for. I know that I have been bought with a price. I know that I have been given new life with Christ. I know that I have been filled with the Holy Spirit as a seal for the day of redemption. One of the differences about Christianity and following Jesus compared to any and every other religion out there is they are always hoping they did enough. And we can know that we have been made right with God through a relationship with Christ. And so I would offer that as the huge difference is we can see one of the things that we see specifically in the New Testament, but in the Bible in general, is the statement, and this we know. And when we can make statements like that, we can say, I know that I belong to Jesus and I know that I will spend eternity with him in heaven. That doesn't come from religion. That comes from a relationship with Jesus Christ. And so I hope that helps you today. Let's keep going in our study, though. Let's look at verses 17 and 19. We're going to see a shift here. So we've had our questions from the Pharisees and we've had our questions from the disciples of John, but now we're going to have someone very different come up, and he is going to have a very different kind of question for Jesus. Picking up in verse 18, we read this. It says, and he was telling them these things, and suddenly one of the leaders came out and knelt down before him, saying, my daughter just died. But come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. So Jesus and his disciples got up, and they followed him. And so this is kind of an interesting scene because we've had the questions from the Pharisees. They're doubting who Jesus is because of certain things. You have the questions of John's disciples, and they have doubt, probably a different doubt than the Pharisees did, but they have doubt of Jesus and they're wanting clarification. And then suddenly you have this other person come in, and it's almost like he broke into the room, like Jesus is doing his teaching. He's teaching his disciples. He's teaching maybe at this point still John's disciples. And suddenly this man busts through the door, and it says that he was a leader, and this probably meant a leader of the synagogue, that he was one of the local religious leaders. He was a guy that was reading the scroll during their Sabbath services, all that type of stuff. And he busts into the room and he says, teacher, rabbi, I need you. And he says this interesting thing. He says, my daughter just died. Now, this could have meant in the original language that she literally had died, or that she was in the process of dying, that she was gasping for her last breath, that they knew it was just a matter of time. And either way, whatever he meant by that, he knew there was an urgency here. And so for this leader of the synagogue, he didn't care about fasting. And he didn't care about who Jesus was spending time with. What he cared about was his child. And with his, I think it was specifically his daughter. And not a particular, we're talking about a little girl, not a particularly important person in the world of Jesus and all that type of stuff. But all he wanted was to see his daughter live. And so he came and he said, my daughter has just died. And it could have meant my daughter is dying as we speak. And he says to him, he goes, but if you touch her, you can make her well. And so he is putting all of his faith and all of his trust in Jesus. It's really a beautiful and remarkable thing. And it just shows that this man had a faith in him that was really uncommon, especially from those who were kind of in the established religious order. And so this is a pretty noteworthy guy, and he has a very big concern for his daughter. And with that, he is going to Jesus because he believes, because of what he has seen and what he has heard, that Jesus can not only heal his daughter, but Jesus can bring his daughter back from death. I want to read what the book here says. It says, Jesus had been teaching the disciples of John more about who he is and why he had come. This was important for them to understand, and he was sharing them these truths when a synagogue leader named Jairus, this is from the other parts of the other Gospels, interrupted his teaching and his plea for his daughter's life. Let me ask you this. I think this is a great question. It's, how would you respond to such an interruption? This was like I said, this was a situation with this Jairus guy. It doesn't mention it in our gospel, but it's in other gospels. They burst into the room. He says, I need you to come with me. I need you to heal my daughter. This is an interruption to Jesus' teaching and Jesus' time with his disciples. How do you respond to interruption, or how would you respond to this interruption? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, answer that question, and then we'll keep going. All right, so how do you respond? I'll be honest with you. In fact, I was just thinking this before I got started with our study today. I don't do well with interruption. I like to have a plan. I like to have a routine. By and large, if you look at my week, I know that I have certain things on certain days, and I try to keep things as on routine as possible. That helps me stay organized. That helps me kind of keep in the right flow. That helps with my productivity. All of those type of things. And so when interruption happens, a lot of times that kind of messes me up, and I can put me in a bad mood. It can kill my productivity. It can throw off my whole week. I don't do well with interruption. And so when we look at this, some of us do well with interruption. Some of us thrive in interruption, and there are times when, if it's one thing after another, I can do okay. But some of us, we struggle with interruption and with being not being able to do what we thought we set out to do. And it's interesting to see how Jesus responds. In fact, what we see from our passage, the book says this. It says, Jesus did not even see this as an interruption, but a chance to demonstrate mercy to a family in need. In putting the life of his daughter in Jesus' hands, this leader was bucking the religious establishment of which he himself was a part. He turned to the only one who could give life back to his girl. With compassion, Jesus rose to accompany the grieving father to his home. Jesus knew that sometimes interruptions are divine appointments. The disciples also followed, and according to Mark, a large crowd followed and pressed against him. This leads the book to ask this question. I really like this question, and it's, why should we take our concerns to Jesus? Why should we go to Jesus with our concerns, with our worries? Why should we, buck the system, if you will, of trying to handle it on our own or keep it to ourselves, and actually go to Jesus and take our concerns to Jesus? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, answer that question, and then we'll look at the last part of our study today. All right, so why should we take our concerns to Jesus? I think the simple answer is because he wants us to, because he cares about us. He wants us to. He is doing things in our life and through our life. And I would just encourage you, God is calling us, and we see it all over the scriptures, to come to him with everything. And so we should come to him with the big stuff and the little stuff and everything in between, so that he might be able to demonstrate his love and his mercy to us and through us for his glory. And I hope you will do that today. Let's look at how this story ends. We actually have a kind of another little interruption, if you will, in our passage, where a woman who has an issue with bleeding goes to Jesus, touches his robe, ends up being healed. We have kind of a little part there, but we're actually going to skip over that, and we're going to look directly at how this issue resolved itself. So I'm going to read for you verses 23 through 26. And I want you to really kind of notice what happens here. And I'll kind of ask you, what's going on here and what's significant about it. So picking up in verse 23, we read these words. It says, when Jesus came to the leader's house, he saw the flute players and a crowd lamenting loudly. Leave, he said, because the girl is not dead, but asleep. And they laughed at him. After the crowd had been put outside, he went in and he took her by the hand, and the girl got up. The news of this spread throughout the whole area. So think about this for a second. They show up, and the book actually does a really good job of explaining this. In our day and age, we show sorrow, we lament, we mourn over the loss of our loved ones. But a lot of times we do it in a very reserved manner. We may cry, we may we're silent. We look down, we're somber and sorrowful, but we're not particularly loud. Well, in Jewish times, that would have been very different. In fact, it was understood that when someone passed away, there was this time of lamenting, and they would be quite loud with it. They would sob, and they would wail, and they would cry out, and they would make a lot of noise. They would even pay people to do this, so that when people died, there would be that commotion, and with that would come music and all sorts of other things to let everyone know that someone had passed away. And that's quite literally what they walked up to. And so some things had to have happened by this point. Someone had to have gone in, confirmed that the little girl had passed, and then people were gathered to them in order to begin the mourning process and to begin this whole ordeal. And so it's not like this has happened just in minutes. It's not like people that weren't sure of what had happened. The fact that there were mourners there and that music was being played meant that the child had indeed passed, that it had been confirmed that she passed, and that they had called the mourners and they had called the people there to lament and to mourn through all of this. So it's quite clear what has happened here. And so when Jesus comes and he says, "Hey, she's not dead, she's just asleep," they quite literally ridicule him. When it says they laughed at him, it wasn't like it was an awkward little chuckle. They laughed at him because they knew death. They knew the difference between this girl has passed and this girl is merely sleeping. And so they quite literally they laughed at him, they ridiculed him for making such a silly comment. And because of that, they were not helping. And so they get moved out. I want to read to you what the book says. It says this: Arriving at the house, Jesus discovered the flute players and the crowd lamenting loudly. These were professional mourners. Their presence indicated that enough time had passed since the daughter had died to summon them. In the words put outside on verse 25 implies more than simply inviting them to step outside. The terminology points to a forceful eviction of the mourners from the house. The presence of mourners was a time honored tradition. So, in the crowd's mind, Jesus was rejecting tradition once again by demanding that they leave the house. But that's not what had. But then this amazing thing happens, and I really want to focus on the what happens here is he even if we say he evicts them from the house, and they probably leave thinking, who is this rabbi? He's disregarding our traditions. He's dishonoring God and probably all these things. And then it says this, and when they'd been put outside, he went in and he just took her by the hand and the girl got up. I want you to think about this for just a second. Jesus had just shown that he was sovereign. He had power over not only just healing, not over just vision, not over just food, but that he could actually raise someone from the dead. He had power over life and death. And what I think is most amazing about this is he doesn't even speak a word, that he just touches her hand and her life is restored and she gets up. He didn't even have to say a word. This man is the creator of heaven and earth, that he is the author of life. He doesn't even need to speak into this woman for life to happen. He merely holds her hand and she gets up and she is alive. And so Jesus again shows his tremendous grace and his tremendous love and his tremendous mercy, but also shows his power, that he is in fact God in the flesh, by exemplifying that he has power even over life and death. The book does ask this question as we close out our study. It says, how does it impact your faith when you read Jesus' miracles and power? Notice again that when all this happens, it says that the news spread through the whole area. When you read passages like this and you get to see God's power on full display through Jesus, how does that impact you? How does that impact your faith? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, answer that question. When you're done, hit play again, and then we'll start to close out our study. I hope stories like these have a really a big impact on you and on your walk with the Lord. And I've thought a lot as we have read the Sermon on the Mount and some of the miracles, and really last chapter in Matthew chapter 8. There's just, when you read about Jesus' miracles and his healing and his love and his mercy, it really should move you to want to love your neighbor better, to trust him more, and to really just remind you that he came to do so much more than even this. And he is showing to everybody that he is indeed God with us, that he has come to dwell among us so that he might bring us into the fullness of a relationship with God. And I hope that's what these type of stories help you with today. The book says this, it says, Jesus demonstrated mercy through both his words and his touch. He always makes time for his people when they are in need. He helped the woman with the bleeding condition, and he helped Jairus' family, and he will help us as well. As we close out our time today, I want us to take a little bit of time, this kind of our application time, and really consider ways that we can help people also. You know, Jesus said in John chapter 20, he said, just as the Lord said, just as the Father sent me, so I send you. And really, I just want you to think as we close out our time, we have this example of Jesus, of him teaching and also him healing in a way to bring people into a closer relationship with God and to bring glory into God. And I want to ask this question: how can we help people and meet their needs for God's glory? But this can be both the physical needs and spiritual needs. This can be both through, meeting physical needs, but also teaching and helping them to meet spiritual needs. And I want you to know, how can we, this is, in our daily life, how can we follow Jesus' example of mercy that we see in these passages? And so here's what we want you to do. We want you to close out your time really talking about this. How can we follow Jesus' example in our reading today, at his example of mercy to people around us as well? How can we help people and meet needs for the glory of God in our daily life? Not just big, huge actions, not just big, huge events, but every day in our lives, how can we meet needs and follow Christ's example of mercy? And then what I want you to do is I want you to close out your time praying that God would open up doors for you to do the very things you discuss. We talk all the time, we're praying for Bob, for burden and opportunity and boldness. How might you pray, and how might God put a burden on you and give you opportunity and the boldness to do it, to meet needs, to follow his example of mercy, and to really live out what we've taught today? Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so glad that you did. We again want to encourage you to join us for worship at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. We are both in person and online through Facebook Live. Thank you again for joining us today. God bless.